action. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here on behalf of Climate Risk Horizon as well as Climate Trends, who are going to discuss with you about climate change, but also about what the banking system needs to put in place to be able to better respond to a changing climate. Frankly, the way parts of India have been reeling under such a punishing heat wave, Delhi included, and for some of us who have been here, the temperature thresholds are being broken each week. And as the risks rise, it's quite evident that social and economic impacts are becoming increasingly evident. 49 degrees, maybe it was just in parts of Delhi for parts of the day, but has brought that stark reality in front of everybody that labor productivity has gotten impacted, school timings have gotten impacted, how people are discussing macroeconomic issues has changed as well. I was taking a look at the Hindustan Times, and I'm based in Delhi. By the time I reached page 12, there were 13 stories around the heat wave and related impacts this morning. Not all of them were about weather forecasting, weather attribution, climate change, but all of them were about wheat imports getting impacted by the heat wave, labor productivity, and Delhi diaries of how labor is not able to cope up, how the financial system needs to play under all of these circumstances, and what are really issues on just the health impacts, heat-related health impacts, economic impacts, etc. And if that narrative and that messaging is any indication, then I think it's quite clear that for those of us who have been green activists or climate campaigners who have been talking about adaptation, which means you adapt to climate change or you reduce and remove carbon, it's quite clear that there are limits to adaptation. Human beings can hardly adapt to 49 degrees or even 46 and 47, and mitigation is the only option. And given then, there is a clear need to reduce and move away from high carbon intensive systems. Renewable energy will have to be the norm for tomorrow. Scaling up of renewables will have to be done faster, quicker, and with greater frequency. Then what is the role that the financial system has to play, and how quickly? And indeed, if I can just labor on the climate side of the rationale a little bit more, this is also the year where all the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports are supposed to come. 3 working group reports have come. It's the year where the assessment report, which is a full body of knowledge and will be the last one to come before 2030, will also be released by around September, October. The report that was released around March actually talked about compounding disasters, and there were chapters on how heat and drought and concurrent effects of heat, etc., will interlace with crop damage, loss of labor productivity, and all of these things in future. What is shocking is that it was a forecast, and incidentally, we don't have to wait long for the IPCC forecast to come true. And that in and of itself speaks to how we are living in some kind of a new normal. Hindustan Times uses this phrase in the headline today that 50 degrees is a new normal for Delhi. But also, given this is the new normal, there are lots of physical risks that come along with it, and a huge number of reputational risks that come to investors, asset managers, banks, owners, etc. That pretty much brings us to the question of why is it that banks should even act? What is it that they are doing already? And what is it that must be done? Sorry for keeping the introduction really long, but I just wanted to stress that this is not just one of those sessions which people like us have been having the last couple of years. It pretty much comes at a time where all of this conversation is front and center of policy attention, and making sure that it reaches the right ears and the right minds is important at this moment. There is very timely analysis that Climate Risk Horizon have done, which Ashish and Sagar will present to you. But before I pass on the mic to Ashish, who will also give the opening remarks, let me please also introduce the panelists who've joined us today to discuss all of these issues that I spoke about. And thanks everyone for joining this afternoon once again. We have Ms. Smita Hari, who's the Vice President, Sustainable Finance and ESG at Octus ESG. We have Abhijit Agarwal, who's the Vice President and Head Sustainability and CSR at Axis Bank. And we have Mr. Pankaj Sharma, who is the co-founder of M Alpha and is here with us. Ashish, who is the CEO of Climate Risk Horizons, and Sagar Asapur, who's a researcher on sustainable finance, also at Climate Risk Horizon, will be leading the first part of this session, where they will offer some opening remarks, top line highlights from their study. Sagar is going to present the findings that they have prepared. And after that, we will enter into a discussion followed by an open moderated floor, where the floor will be open and participants can also ask questions and share their insights. But that's it for the moment. We have about 90 minutes. I'll hand it to you, Ashish, first to share your insights and offer some opening remarks as well.
Thanks, Arati, for that, and great job setting the stage. I'll just keep my remarks really short because Arati's done such a good job of bringing us into, keeping us in the context of what's going on. When we started talking about this and planning this internally, that was about 4 or 5 months ago. And because of everything that's happened just in the last 2 months in India, I think everyone is completely aware of the issue now and how serious it is. So just a very brief introduction about Climate Risk Horizons. We're about 2 or 3 years old now. Our main focus as a think tank is looking at the energy sector and also looking at the finance sector and how the two interplay with each other in the Indian context specifically. When we started looking at this issue of financial institutions in India, our main concern was trying to figure out, we know that climate change is going to touch every sector of the Indian economy to one degree or another. For the most part, it's going to be for the worse. There are going to be severe impacts. So in that context, what is the role of the financial sector? When we're talking about both mitigation and adaptation, both of which will be important going forward, what is the role that the financial sector should be playing? What is the role that it is playing right now? Is the financial sector, has it taken on board the policies and the changes in governance and strategy that are required for the coming decades in a climate changed world? And we quickly found out that there was not much hard information in the public domain in India on these issues. That's why we wanted to start with basically setting the baseline, seeing who's doing what have they said, what policies are available. And that's why we went and looked at pretty much all the large significant banks in India. Sagar will go into the details of those banks when we go forward. But our objective was basically trying to set a baseline. Who has policies in place? What governance structures are in place already? Are there any commitments already on the table? Given the Indian government goal of 2070 carbon neutrality, is anybody starting to align their portfolios for that, starting to plan for that, etc.? So these were some of the issues that were going through our mind when we started looking at this, and the result is the report that Sagar is going to present very shortly. But I think, just to stress, and I'll hand over to Sagar soon, but just to stress the criticality of this moment. We have seen heat waves, yes, for the last 2 months, pretty much, and that has impacted, obviously, social impacts, but it's also having economic impacts. The fear is that we're going to see, in the next few years, we're going to see these climate events, not maybe 2 in a year or 3 in a year, but a succession, and we will be in a never-ending loop where we move from heat wave to flood, to drought in different parts of the country. And each of these will have economic impacts, whether it's crops in one area, whether it's economic productivity because of a full month of floods, lands followed by landslides that wipe out key infrastructure projects. So there are going to be knock-on financial impacts. It's already having an impact on the economy, and the fears that it could get much worse. So if that is the context, how prepared are we to manage those financial impacts? And what are we doing to basically get ourselves on a path where the mitigation and adaptation that we need is starting to actually manifest itself in the real world? I'll just stop there and turn it over to Sagar, who has done really most of the heavy lifting on this analysis. Sagar, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ashish and Aarti, for that kind introduction. Let me quickly share my screen for the presentation. I think my screen is visible to all.
Yes.
So yeah, good afternoon to all. Today I'll be presenting a brief analysis of a report launched in March this year, and it's called Unprepared India's Big Banks Score Poorly on Climate Challenge. As you may know, climate change affects nearly all economic sectors, and levels of exposure and the impact of climate risk differ by sector, industry, and geography, as well as a type of organizations. Mainly, there are two types of climate risk: uh, transition risk and physical risk. Transition risk arise from the process of adjusting towards a low carbon economy, and the physical risk arise from climate related weather events. But I think a third risk flagged by the UK's central bank, the Bank of England, is the liability risk. It can arise from people or businesses seeking compensation for the losses they may have suffered due to the physical or transition risks arising from climate change. For example, suppose an investor back a business which goes on to make a loss due to climate related events. So there may then be a question like whether the business had provided enough information about its exposure to the climate related financial risk. So, and if the investor felt this information had not been provided, then they might claim against the business. So therefore, the possible future financial impact on a firm's or a company's current financial position can have on income statement, cash flow statement, and balance sheet, etc. So as per recent IPCC report, as Aarti had already highlighted on the mitigation of climate change released in April this year, it is the first time where there is a separate chapter on investment and finance. And the report acknowledged that today climate change is a strategic priority in most financial institutions. And some of the financial authorities, including Reserve Bank of India, recognize that the climate change represents a major source of systemic risk, particularly for banks with portfolios concentrated in certain economic sectors or geographical areas. Also, numerous studies have projected that impact on Indian economic growth and GDP from business as usual and continued climate inaction had been uh, focused on India's financial sector, which has to play a critical role in responding to the climate crisis, both in terms of managing the risk that climate change poses to their operations, as well as in terms of financing India's green transition. As there is an increasing awareness of the financial sector's role, but there has been a little information in the public domain to gauge the way the sector is preparing itself. Prior studies in assessing the preparedness of financial institutions towards climate-related risks have faced difficulties due to methodological challenges and gaps in availability of granular data. Our assessment also struggled with some similar challenges given the lack of standardization in terms of institutional reporting and absence of granular data. Therefore, we undertook a criteria-based assessment of 34 banks, which includes 12 public sector, 18 private sector, and 4 small finance banks in the top 1,000 entities by market capitalization at the Bombay Stock Exchange as on 31st March 2021. So, and as per SEBI rules, it is mandatory for these banks to file business responsibility and sustainability report from this financial year onwards. In order to conduct a robust systematic analysis, our analysis was guided by 8 principles. Data availability should be based on publicly available information, objectivity with minimum space for subjective interpretation, transparency uh, for banks, feedbacks and comments, usability to different stakeholders, consistency with the TCFD's recommendations, completeness to the bank as a whole, coverage to the individual bank and not their subsidiaries, and finally, decision relevance in the context of India, that is pragmatic to India's current position on the world stage. The criteria covered a range of issues, including disclosure of emissions across all operations as well as financed emissions, then fossil fuel exclusion policies, climate scenario analysis of portfolios, climate-related risk management processes, green financing, and net zero targets. Our analysis showed a broad pattern of climate-related risk preparedness in Indian banking system, which is summarized in four broad themes: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So our findings showed that only two banks have an exclusion policy that prohibits lending for construction of new coal power plants or the extension of an existing coal power plant. Only three banks have started building internal capacity to undertake forward-looking assessments like climate scenario analysis or climate stress testing. However, it is very long for other banks to catch up to gauge the resiliency for their portfolios. None of the banks have a long-term or net zero target here with an implementation plan covering all scopes of emissions. However, two banks have set net zero targets with implementation plans for their scope 1 and 2 emissions only. On the positive side, 27 banks have issued green loans, bonds, financing towards climate change mitigation adaptation sectors. On climate risk management, only 8 of the 34 banks have a specific climate or ESG related risk management process at the board level. 26 of 34 banks yet to disclose the most basic environmental indicators, that is scope 1 and 2 emissions. Only one bank has disclosed its scope 3 category 15 investment emissions, and only 6 banks have verified their operational emissions by a third party.
Sagar, sorry to interrupt you. Like, there is a request for you to speak a bit louder. Some of the participants are not able to hear you that well.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. So, coming to the overall ranking, the figure provides the overall score and ranking for banks assessed. The top 10 banks are all private sector banks, except for the State Bank of India at 6th position. It is worth mentioning that more than half of the 34 banks scored either 0 or a single point. On GHG disclosures, only 8 of the 34 banks reported sufficient data to estimate CO2 emissions, and this was mostly limited to scope 1 and 2 emissions. On sustainability reporting, only 19% of banks have reported either sustainability, ESG, or integrated reporting. We had also assessed or mapped BRSR filing by banks for that financial year. And in order to effectively manage climate-related risks, banks need to have in place policies related to environment and social risk. Only 21% of assessed banks have them. Now, the key areas for banks and regulators to focus on are for public disclosure and transparency. Banks should not only focus on financial materiality, but also on environment and social materiality, meaning they should measure their impact on the climate as well as measure the impact that climate change has or will have on them. There should be harmonization of report formats between SEBI and RBI, mainly to simplify reporting and verification of reports. Banks to have a coal exclusion policy. Banks should adopt a more proactive and progressive view on issues of climate, biodiversity, and human rights, which is not clear in the disclosures. Banks should start using scenario analysis to appropriately incorporate potential effects of climate change into their planning process, and potential business implications. By considering all scopes of emission, banks should set minimum and long-term targets to reduce carbon intensity and apply carbon abatement measures such as internal carbon pricing, carbon budgeting, and carbon offsetting. Banks needs to disclose targets for green finance. RBI may periodically review the priority sector lending scheme by including electric vehicles, battery storage, and green hydrogen. It is important to learn from a growing international body of work by joining national or international climate initiatives such as Equator Principles or UN Principle for Responsible Banking, etc. Finally, a climate-related risk identification and process under board oversight is essential for any financial institution. Finally, this analysis highlights that the Indian banking system is not prepared for the systemic risk that climate change poses. With a few notable exceptions, majority of banks has not even started to put in place the most rudimentary mechanisms. Private sector banks have performed better than public sector banks. India's current goal of carbon neutrality by 2070 implies that easier to transition sectors, that is electricity, transport, industrial power, must start moving now, align itself, and make a rapid progress. This requires finance and innovative financing models suited to the Indian context. Banks must also prepare to limit their future financial losses due to climate change. Lastly, setting a clear target dates to phase out fossil fuel investments and exposure to high carbon sectors is key to manage long-term financial impacts as the global economy decarbonizes. I will end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sagar. I think we can spend the next 20 minutes or so, I would think, where I can at least pose a question to each of the panelists based on what Ashish and Sagar mostly showed right now. And, let us see how each one of you see it from your perspective. I think the last slides on recommendation and what's good and bad said a few nice things. You're talking about how the electricity, transport, and industrial power sectors are actually easy to transition, but given how the heat wave became like equal to #power crisis, that's definitely not so easy to transition. So it feels that there is also, when the rubber hits the road, it's really complicated. I'll pose questions, but something you said about net zero targets and therefore the need for compliance. I mean, for those of us who follow the UNFCCC COP process, India this year has to submit a written response or a written description of what its long-term strategy will be. And there are interministerial committees that have been formed, which have all the CSOs across the country. And there is active discussion that is going on along with key ministries and departments before the end of the year, when India will submit its long-term strategy, which will be 2070 decarbonization, but it will have 2030 targets, etc. And I think a lot of what you have discussed will have a bearing on what really the financial sector also needs to do, because where is the money for moving to net zero? Anyway, may I first invite Mr. Abhijit Agarwal. You are from Access. There is a certain consumer perception sometimes as well that is associated with a bank which has sustainable lending policy as compared to others, especially because you're also publicly very visible in what you do. What is your experience and vision on incorporating climate related risks in lending? And also just to say that as I invite you and Ms. Smita Hari and Pankaj, maybe you can take 5 to 7 minutes and share your perspectives in the first round.
Sure. Thank you, Aarti. And thank you, Sagar, for that presentation. I hope I'm audible to everyone. So thank you for that. And I think I must commend, first of all, Climate Risk Horizons for taking this study. And the way it was picked up in the media, I think definitely there's a lot of stakeholder interest. You could see that there's a lot of stakeholders who were interested to know about what Indian banks have been doing on climate risk. And really, I think it does bring out a lot of the good points and a lot of the necessities that I think Indian banks must seriously start looking towards. And I think one aspect that was very visible is how the private sector banks were very different in terms of the direction from the public sector banks when it came to climate risk management. And I think that is something I would like to delve upon also when I speak to you. See, from a climate risk perspective, I think one thing we have to agree on is that, first of all, Ashley and Aarti talked about what we're facing. In April was the hottest month ever. And just India's energy demand just really massively spiked up. And what that has done is now that coal mines are being opened up. That the government has actually mandated that thermal power plants have to keep running. So if you're not able to, if you're a coal plant built on imported coal, you have to find a way to manage, but you have to keep running to meet the demand. So what I want to highlight is that a bank does not work in a silo. A bank is part of a much larger ecosystem where a lot of these factors have to be managed and shared by all. So even though India has a net zero target by 2070, are you going to put India in bad light now that India is asking all the coal plants, scaling up its coal production? So definitely, I think what the heat wave has really shown is that there are a lot of limitations to risk management. And I think we have to take that into account, that you really cannot plan 100% for the future, because something like this that's unprecedented, what it does, and in the short term, what we're seeing is across Europe, across North America, everyone, we're just dialing down on climate commitments. Whether it's Europe now suddenly talking about nuclear power as a part, Japan's talking about nuclear power as a part of energy mix. So even BlackRock, the great example of BlackRock, which just recently said that now they will go a little slower on those investor votings, proxy voting, when it comes to climate action. So really, I think in the short term, I feel a lot of that climate action, the risk management, has really given way for pragmatism. Energy security comes first. And I think I see that across, you'll see economies are following that, large companies are following that, even banks are following that. But that being said, what that has also done is it's really, in a way, this could also accelerate the movement towards low carbon transition. And I think what these incidences, like what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia war, the heat wave, all this is going to do is just going to, I think it's could trigger an acceleration towards low carbon transition. Coming to the point of risk, banks have to be aligned. In the end, even Axis or any other bank, we are all Indian banks. So we work in the larger context of what are the needs of the country, the kind of policy direction that the country takes. So that way we all work in unison on that. And I feel policy, that's why it plays a very, very important role. The reason I wanted to point that out about private sector banks working at a certain level versus public sector banks. And I feel that could also be a lot of it because private sector banks have a lot of foreign institutional investors who come from those economies where these aspects, climate risk, climate management, are a much, much bigger factor. And that could also be a trigger. But that being said, if I had to just take an example of Axis Bank, I don't know about anyone else. The bank is cognizant. We talked about our own journey. Over the last few years, the bank has been working on how to scale up its environmental social risk management. For the last 7 years, we've had this policy, environment and social policy, which looks at environmental social risk management in our wholesale lending portfolio, for example. Last year, we established the ESG committee of the board. So what that has done is really put a board level oversight on a lot of these things. Same risk management now is a part of a board level discussion, not just at the ESG committee, but even the risk committee talks about it. So from that angle, really, I think the risk management discussion is really fully underway. Sagar's last slide talked about stress testing, scenario analysis. One practical limitation I just want to highlight is that there is no standard benchmark still globally on what is a good climate stress test, for example. What is a good scenario analysis? So the lack of data has been a very big challenge. And I don't think it's just for anyone who wants to plan in this direction. The lack of data has been a big challenge. But I think that is also changing. More data will now become live. And I think that is where we have to be cognizant that even banks do work in limitations. But that being said, everyone's aware of it. Everyone's working in a certain direction. India is going to release its green taxonomy later this year. It's expected. That will bring a lot more clarity in this whole space about where banks can lend, so I think that will bring a lot of clarity. The RBI has been very vocal on climate risk assessment, climate risk management. Eventually that may turn into some policy actionables for banks, and they will be followed. So I think definitely the levers are there for a much improved climate risk management among Indian banks. And I think we will see that happen over time.
Thanks, Abhijit. I think, of course, it's becoming very attractive across the world. Global media writes about the way the lending system is being revolutionized. You have all these, very often coverage of how shareholder resolutions are being passed. Sometimes in JP Morgan, I think recently was in Citigroup as well, and it was not taken forward. Something happened in Japan. So clearly, they are the early movers in the financial system, and maybe the data will come from there. But I don't know if that makes sense. The recipients of extreme weather will be vulnerable countries and countries like India. So how to even match where cutting edge financial system exists is not the same place as where the impacts are taking place. And there has to be a way to bring that together as well. But I think that's a different point. Maybe I will move. Sorry. Would you like
sorry,
to
I just wanted to say that actually, and I'm very sorry, Pankaj and Smita, if I can just take one more minute. No, so there is also a talk of over financialization of the climate problem, if I may use that word. Tomorrow, if the world and say India has unlimited supply of capital, do you think we'll solve climate change? So I'll leave that for everyone to think about that. So it's really, so everything works in a system. So like you said, good lending, even if tomorrow we have the best climate risk management, and even all our capital goes into positive climate action or into renewables, there's still a lot of fundamental challenges that are still there. Water, for example, the loss of biodiversity. So it really our policies have to work in that collective thought process.
For sure. And I think with my little understanding, that's what ESG does, that you have parameters which are environmental, social, governance, where you're not just looking at the bottom line as hardcore profit, but there are different criteria in how you look at profit. But I think that's also the moment where I would like to call you, Smita, to talk a little bit. ESG reporting has become quite revolutionized. It's being spoken about a lot. It's taken a lot of important center stage conversation. Certainly, it's not a new subject, but it definitely has a role to play on how climate risk can be assessed in the banking sector. Could you talk a little bit about the role of ESG disclosures in assessing such climate risks?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. So pleased to be a part of this panel on this very pertinent topic. And hi, Abhijit. Hi, Pankaj. Good to meet you again. So the sixth assessment report of the IPCC has painted a pretty grim picture. I think both Sagar and Aarti have pointed that out. And so climate action has become an absolute necessity, right? Now, the effect of climate risks on business models of both financial institutions as well as non-financial institutions, it's multidimensional in the sense that there is derived impact of these risks. And therefore, there is a very, it requires a very robust action plan. And accordingly, responses of both central banks and supervisors and regulators around the world have also been emerging. So talking specifically about disclosure, so one of the landmark developments in the area of climate change has been the the TCFD, introduction of TCFD in 2017. So TCFD, as most of us know, emphasizes disclosures on climate risks, opportunities, and the related financial impact, and therefore provides a very holistic view of how business models of the reporting entity will be affected by climate events. So, for example, banks, which are providers of capital, need to identify new risks and opportunities which arise from climate change and therefore capture the financial impact of these on their lending portfolios. So the recommendations of TCFD are around the 4 areas, which I think even Sagar spoke about, governance, strategy, risk management, and matrix. And they're designed in such a way that it's adoptable by organizations and also has a forward-looking element to it because of scenario analysis component. So if you look at it from a governance standpoint, right? So disclosing on the organization's governance around climate risks and opportunities. So board oversight and emphasizing the management's role in assessing and managing climate risks. So Abhijit spoke about how the board is now involved in these aspects. So from that perspective, it becomes important to disclose this. If we talk about strategy, that talks about disclosing of the actual and potential impacts of climate risks and opportunities over the short term, medium term, and long term on the organization's business strategy and financial planning. Also talking about risks, climate scenarios in this bucket. The risk management point, talks about disclosing processes of identifying, assessing, and managing risks, and how these risks are actually integrated into your overall risk management framework. So that becomes very critical. And the last element talks about the matrix used to assess the climate risks and opportunities and what would be the targets. So this way, this particular framework provides a very comprehensive and holistic view about the climate aspect of an organization. So if you look at the country level developments towards the reporting on climate, New Zealand passed the first, world's first climate change disclosures law for all of its banks to become mandatory by 2023. UK became the first G20 country to enforce mandatory TCFD reporting for its largest businesses and FIs, and it's already in place since April this year. So many other countries, like Switzerland, France, China, Canada, so they followed suit, with plans of, integrating climate as a very important factor when you disclose. So across the world, regulators are increasingly leaning towards enhancing climate-related disclosures. So banks will therefore need to shift course, to align to these requirements, and that could be faster than anticipated. Also from an investor standpoint, like I think Abhijit brought out, that because most private sector banks are backed by foreign investors, so that has become up. So both from a regulatory standpoint as well as a market standpoint, this requirement is coming up. And given that, banks like asset owners and asset managers, they sit on top of the financing value chain, right? So they have an important role to play, in influencing companies to which they lend to provide better climate-related disclosures. And that means that banks will not only need to report on climate and ESG, etc., of their own operations, but also needs to, start looking at financed emissions, which is basically the information pertaining to their loan portfolios. But, as bank managements will be required to disclose on these things, it is important to acknowledge that the road towards adoption of non-financial disclosures is very complicated. It's uphill. It's not straightforward. Companies face numerous challenges, and collecting and aggregating data is the biggest, probably the biggest challenge. Scattered ESG ratings is another challenge. And also the rise of so many sustainability disclosure standards, so if you talk about climate, of course, we think of TCFD, but when you talk of ESG disclosures, there are so many different standards, and actually leads to disclosure fatigue and confusion among the reporters. Also high cost, time, resources involved, lack of internal skill sets. All this is kind of, it becomes very important to consider these factors when you talk of ESG related reporting. So one good thing which, when we talk of different disclosure frameworks is there has been an ongoing effort globally to align standards and requirements. So last year, SASB and integrated reporting, it got merged to form the Value Reporting Foundation. And that in turn, there was a recent merger of that with Climate Disclosure Standards Board. So all this, is it's a step in the right direction to kind of standardize reporting and, also develop comparable non-financial disclosures. So what I want to say, before I conclude, is the global movement towards increased ESG and climate disclosures is it's a very important development for banks, Indian banks as well. And the rising pace of climate dialogue combined with the shift in investor focus on climate, on ESG, etc., will translate into a cascading effects for both banks as well as borrowers. And that's likely to happen faster than one would anticipate. So I'd like to stop for now.
Thanks, Smita. And I think clear that you said some of these things are very complex. They're not easy. It's an uphill task. And I think just as you juxtapose them with how climate impacts are also complex, compound, also uphill for when they happen, I think that maybe few things only happen when the time is right. Nobody would have imagined that there will be such a discussion about coal and what to do with the coal policy, but how the heat wave rammed into parts of North India, I think it forced that conversation. So pretty much, I guess, a lot of the movement in the financial system perhaps might happen when there's some shakeup like that. But in the end, it's also not just environmental would be the general feeling. Like companies are supposed to be more responsible, but it's not just like responsible to the environment or the climate where nobody can see or feel, but it's also like companies have to be more responsible to communities, etc. And there is a social aspect to it, and there is both the reputational risk as well as nobody wants to go wrong in the optics of it as well. Leave aside, the real bottom lines. But maybe I will turn to you, Pankaj, to also talk about what do you feel are roadblocks in the way the ESG analysis is done in India? It feels like there is a lot of discussion on these matters, but yet it's quite early days as well. And I'll let you share your perspective.
Okay, thanks, Aarti. Thanks everyone on the panel and participants. Right, I would say stimulating discussion in terms of on the specific questions on the challenges for ESG. I think there are two basic issues I want to highlight. One is that often when we discuss the financials and also the companies and the services industry in this space, sometimes we miss the context. So for example, like 20 years ago, when there was a lot of investment happening in telecom, then around 10, 15 years ago, a lot of thermal power plants were being constructed. Any bank or any financial institution at that time lending to those sectors is aligned with the economic reality. You can't really penalize those firms and the companies which are doing that lending and which are doing, in a way, contributing to the economic growth and the GDP. That's something which you have to remember. So, like, you can't have a yardstick which is same and consistent all of it. You have to look at the context at what point in history you are looking at the situation. The second thing is that when you see that the basic problem, as we see in most of the cases, is as a global challenge, like scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 is most complicated and very difficult to calculate because of double counting issues, because of other challenges. I think this applies to banks also. So if you look at what happens in the case of a particular institution, for example, like it's a microfinance, or it's very big in consumer banking, lending too much in auto space. And if you compare it with a lender who is mostly into commercial lending, very large infrastructure projects, those are the aspects which would be in some way need to be aligned. We can't have a situation where people would apply the same thing and the same benchmark, same parameters to everyone. It also depends on what happens in your business model. And this is something which is very important. So like some of the large banks might have more muscle to probably get a low cost financing, and then in turn they will have more responsibility to lend to sectors which probably need funding but are not that attractive. Even if you have a situation where the climate aspects are very, very different. So I think that's another point. In terms of the challenge for ESG data, I think one of the biggest problems is not just India specific, but happens across the board, that at times the focus is much more on the qualitative aspect, the qualitative data. So like you will have very nice glossy reports talking about a lot of good things, but in terms of hard data, you will not find much in terms of what's your plan for 2030, net zero, 2050, what is the trajectory and how does it look like? All those things are definitely, as Sagar very rightly highlighted, many of those things are probably missing. So you might have a 200 pages report, which looks very good, very nice pictures, very nice stories, but not very useful in terms of the quantitative analysis. And that's something which we need to take care of. Also, I think in terms of, as I was saying, that in terms of the size of the firms, the different companies, different institutions will have different budgeting. The firm which has, let's say, X revenue and Y profit compared to somebody else who has 100X revenue and 1000Y profits, the aspects which would probably be required in terms of reporting, in terms of data presentation, all that a bigger firm probably has a better handle on what they want to report and how they want to report. And that's something which we have to normalize in a way that we can compare. So I would say that this is something which is very important for the analysis of ESG data. And I think this is happening across the board now. A lot of times when we look at, especially in the context of sustainability and ESG ratings, a lot of asset managers have started to do their own analysis. So they use their own proprietary framework, which is getting very popular. And it also depends on the context and the priorities an asset manager might have. So all the asset owners, asset allocators, asset managers, they will have different priorities depending on what they think is more important in the top-down E, S, and G, and then the sub-issues which they're dealing with. And they will use their own proprietary frameworks because the general trust and general credibility of the data which is coming either from third-party sources or even from the firms is not very, very high. So I would say that I think if we find a way where the institutions start to think that this is an opportunity for them, it's not just a compliance burden, because most of the times when you talk to firms, they think that it's kind of compliance burden, like your report banana. So, and that is the big challenge. Like you tell them that, okay, this is not just a risk. So for example, I talk about this quite a lot, that TCFD framework talks a lot about the risk as well as the opportunities. So it's an opportunity. Like if a firm is doing a good job on understanding the climate risk for a plant which is in Northeast, and if you see in that region that there are more possibilities and a higher probability of climate change and climate risk, definitely you have to price that in your loans. Similarly, like if you are lending to a house owner and it's a tsunami prone area, definitely you have to price that in. And those are the opportunities which can probably give an edge to a bank or a financial institution to use this as a competitive advantage for them, and not just a compliance burden. So I would say that if you change the narrative a bit and talk about the opportunity which could be there for the banks and the financial institutions to use this and analysis and data for a better risk assessment and better approach of their business, I think that's half the job done. So I'll stop here. Took probably a long time, but I think it's very important to build the right kind of narrative, not focused on compliance, but focused on the opportunity which this analysis can create. Thank you.
Noted, and I think point well made also. We talk about the physical risk and the transition risk, and when we started, we also talked about the liability risk, but the way you're saying it is to not just pose it as a liability risk, but really as an opportunity for banks as well to see it like that if they have to factor that cost. And pretty much, point taken that if this is just a matter of compliance and to prepare reports, that's not exciting enough if that's not adding, to the opportunity of even what the bank is there for. And it's not there for social service. So fair enough. I think there was a point that was made on in the chat. There is a point actually, and now I just want to open the floor as well, take some questions. They're in the chat box. There is a first question which talks about the taxonomy, and there are conversations that are happening. The Ministry of Finance has to prepare a taxonomy of, what will really go as green investments and what will not qualify, and that I think will decide in a big way of what will make the cut as sustainable investment and what will not. I think the question has been answered. It's sitting elsewhere, but yeah, the question really is that should India formulate its own taxonomy? I think it's already doing, or should it just adopt from EU? I'm sure it's getting inspired by EU, but I'll let Ashish answer this a little bit on how the discussions on how much Indian banks should act also depend on what the financial taxonomy will be like. And then Smita, please come in as well.
Sure. So I think on the taxonomy issue, like Abhijit said, we should know more in a few months. I haven't seen anything that allows us to actually judge that against what's happening internationally, but I would think that it should be fairly largely aligned. But I'd just like to spend a minute talking about the whole, something that Abhijit flagged as well, that we're seeing globally in terms of the default response when there is a crisis being to go back to what we've done in the past. So if there's a crisis, energy crisis, gas supplies from Russia a problem, okay, more gas supplies from elsewhere. Or their coal was not guaranteeing energy security, so we need more coal. I mean, that's really quite the famous saying, right? It might be apocryphal, but definition of insanity is doing things again. I mean, we've seen in the last year that coal has not secured energy security in India. That case has been quite clear. We had that shortage in, October, November last year, and then again, this what's happening now. We just did some preliminary calculations, and we'll be releasing that soon. But what we found is that if India was actually on track to meet its 175 gigawatt target as of today, that power crisis would not have occurred. It would not have occurred if we were on track with RE. So you're not talking about, we are not fortunately in a position today where we are saying that it's either or, okay? Because no one is saying that India has to stop burning coal tomorrow or even in 2 years' time or in 5 years' time. Coal is going to have a gradual ramp down and phase down, but it's important that RE starts delivering, because that is really going to help you conserve your coal supply so when it's most important, and it's going to help you deliver. So if the response to this crisis, and there's obviously, again, coming back to what Abhijit said, it's not just money that's the issue, right? There's politics that comes into play. There's a whole political economy. So if the response to every crisis is to double down on what's causing the crisis in the first place, fossil fuels, then that's just a recipe for disaster. So we need to find a way to break out of that cycle. Thankfully, the economics of renewable energy provide us a really strong opportunity to do that. But yes, there are political issues. It's not just a clear economic issue. So how do we use finance innovatively to just basically fasten and hasten the transition in a way that makes the most sense for India? If you look at what's happening with the coal markets internationally and coal prices, just looking at it a very short-term lens, wow, this looks like a huge investment opportunity. Look at the coal prices internationally. Is that sustainable? I mean, we saw just a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, coal prices were down in the dumps. So we need to have a longer term perspective on things. And I think that's where the whole strategy of banks and financial institutions comes into place. What is your longer term strategy? If you don't operate with a longer term strategy, then and you're only looking at 1 or 2 year horizons, then yes, you might make money 1 or 2 years, but eventually, obviously the planet will suffer, but eventually the financial stability of the institution itself, I think, would be at risk.
Smita, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to actually come in on the taxonomy point, the question which was on taxonomy. I think it was already answered that yes, India is looking at developing its own taxonomy. I think there was also a question if we should just pick up something from the EU or something. What one has to remember is India is quite unique in its, I mean, you can't just pick up something from EU because India has a whole social angle to it. So while the EU taxonomy is the green taxonomy as of now, when the Indian taxonomy comes out, it is important to kind of factor in the social aspect. You can't just close down coal mines and you'll obviously achieve your green targets there, but what happens to all those workers who are working in those coal mines, right? So I think it's important to look at taxonomy both from the green as well as the social angle when it comes to India because of our unique fabric, so to say. Just wanted to make that point.
And I just want to, sorry, Aarti, may I just take a minute? So I want to just highlight this fact also that there is a common understanding and perception that coal, thermal power and renewable energy are just equally proportionate. The point I'm trying to make, it's not like if I shut down a coal power plant of say 1 gigawatt, I can just fully replace it with a thermal or with a solar power plant of 1 gigawatt. It doesn't work that way. It's a plant load factor. There's a lot of factors at play, and we must also keep in mind that there are technological limitations. In evenings when the demand for power is highest, you cannot have solar power. You still need thermal power to provide that electricity. So till renewable energy also reaches a stage that we have to be mindful and be realistic about that this world will need thermal power till renewables can really fully, whether it's battery storage, even battery storage is not at that stage where we just completely wish away thermal power. So I think that technological limitations of renewable currently also have to be taken into account, which is what makes this sector also much more riskier currently than a very well understood sector such as thermal power.
Yeah, I think this is a very contentious matter, and I don't think even those who are pushing for renewables are really saying that coal will not be in the mix. I think the question really is that how much do you do to maintain short-term, like you have to meet power demand and there is an imminent crunch and that needs to be taken care of. And what do you do in the long term? So do you extract coal from existing mines and just use it for the time you build up your renewables and storage, which is next 2 to 5 to 7 years? Or do you actually invest in a new thermal power plant, which will have a running life of 4 decades? I think that's the question, but you all will be more well-versed than me to answer the question on stranded assets. So I will leave it, but I think that's where everybody debates. And I was seeing on Twitter yesterday, there was a image which actually said, yes, the power generation from renewables actually went up to 20-21%. And maybe it's just incidental, maybe it just happened in a particular period of the day, maybe it was just a one-off thing, but these things are going to happen more and more, and really things are moving in one direction. It's a lot of inflection point moment, but yeah, I know that there are some journalists over here as well. There is very obvious interest on what is happening on coal, and is that the right thing to do? Maybe the way you answered the question, both Ashish, you and Abhijit as well, has been from the financial sector. From the point of view of government and meeting consumer demand, those are different concerns. They have to perhaps dig up coal, but I will just let you have the final word on it. There was a question from Ramesh on has anybody looked at the insurance sector? I also see that it got answered a little bit, but any information on who'd lose more and faster in case a climate event happens? Anything to say with respect to how insurance sector is looking at climate risk? Are they able to consider it well enough? Has there been anything that has been revealed in your findings? Sagar, would you like to add anything here? Ashish, anyone?
So that's actually a very good question, because that is something that we want to look at, just as we looked at banks, what's happening in the insurance sector. But we haven't frankly looked at it yet. We haven't found anything. I don't know, perhaps Pankaj and Smita might have some ideas in terms of what the insurance sector is doing on this. But I think it's a fascinating case study to just look at what the impacts on the insurance sector have been from just look at the last 2 or 3 years for any of the climate events that have happened and what those impacts will be, because that will be basically a microcosm of what's going to happen. But I'd be really interested to hear from the other panelists, their thoughts on this.
Thanks, Ashish. I think, of course, we have looked at some of the international insurance companies and also the reinsurance sector. And I would say that when we compare, it's not about taking sides, but in terms of preparedness, because they have more at stake. Many of the international insurance companies, they are at least talking about a lot more on what would be the challenges they would be facing and how they are preparing for it. And that's a good thing, because in terms of their preparedness, because there was an example, I think a couple of years ago, when there was a massive sudden flash flood in Abu Dhabi, so like of all the places in Abu Dhabi. So imagine in a place which usually doesn't get much of a rain, and then suddenly in a flash flood incident, you have losses to the tune of almost 120% of your annual. So imagine what kind of risk you have in those kind of situations. And there are many companies which purely because of that event revamped their risk assessment framework and their models. And a lot of these companies, when you look at, as I said, international examples, they have looked at the aspect and they are revamping their models. They are looking at what could be the challenges they would be facing and how to price that in. Because ultimately, if they go wrong in that assessment, they are gone. So Indian context, I would say that still we have some catch up to do, because I really don't see that kind of preparedness, or at least that kind of public discussion in their disclosures. Not yet, but internationally, insurance sector is moving very quickly and very fast on some of these issues, and that's a good thing. I hope that this will also start happening in India, and there will be more public discussions and more in their disclosures. But I would not say that the situation is very bad. Globally, I think it has done a lot of, I would say the sector has done a lot of good work in the last 5 years to prepare themselves to get ready for what kind of risk they are dealing with and what kind of situation they might be facing. And not just next 15 years, 20 years. Many of these companies are even talking about 2100, so like 80 years down the line. And that's a very, very good thing. Like 80 years, 100 years, when somebody has that kind of long-term vision, and at least preparedness will begin from the realization and having that sensitivity that you are dealing with something which is not a 1 year or 2 year kind of a thing. It's a very long-term thing, and they're working on it. So that's a good thing.
Thanks, Pankaj. And while you have the mic, can I also ask you? And now I just wanted to, move towards the last part of this conversation. Mostly
before that, just one more thing on coal, which like a lot of people talked about. I think it's a sector. I think we have to look at the point which I was making on the local context. India is, we have a lot of thermal coal, not great quality, but very cheap to produce, because we have mostly the open cast mining. Coal India, largest producer, produces almost 90% of plus their production comes from open cast mining, which is very, very cheap. Of course, it's more polluting, but I think those kind of realities you can't ignore. We have a situation where, like, if there are power cuts for 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day, and what Abhijit and everybody talked about, that this is not a situation which is having an easy solution. If India has, like, we import coke, because for our steel plants, we need to import anyway. And if we start importing a lot more imported coal for thermal plants as well, that's of course a disaster. So we need, in the interim, a transition plan, a plan which is more practical. We can't take a very theoretical approach, which is anyway not going to work because of the public pressure and because of the issues which are involved. But I would say that the local realities in each and every sector, we have to look at that first, and then probably we can arrive at a practical solution which might work. Sorry, apologize.
Oh, no, you're right. And, we can go on this, and this can really turn into a conversation about the coal crisis. And we had a similar conversation last week when some of the other experts who are dealing with the power sector were also there. And I think it's pretty clear that the way heat wave got equated to power crisis and coal shortage, is really not coal shortage. There is enough coal that is being mined and kept on the sidings. It was a question of transporting that coal. It was, I think, a problem of transmission and transport. It was not a problem of lack of coal. So now when the coal ministry gives a directive that, the mining can happen and through abandoned mines, you can extract more, as a responsible regulation and governance mechanism, it of course makes sense, because there is no other method available at the moment to generate more coal. The rakes were limited, the transportation could only be ramped up to a certain extent, and therefore easiest thing to do is to mine more coal. But I think for leaders in financial sector and some of you who also have the thought leadership ability, maybe the question to ask is also, and I am going to pose this question, on the one hand, RBI, was it the SEBI guidelines? Sorry, my question is might be a little misplaced, but there were these guidelines last year where big companies were supposed to do disclosure of how they are investing, and on the other hand, you have the coal ministry, which is asking to open up more mines. So does that kind of guideline from SEBI interact counterintuitively with what the coal ministry is doing? And it's and I understand that we are not juxtaposing one against the other in a fair way, but because as financial experts, you all are also talking about the coal shortage, I think it's also important to realize that if we mix up all of this, then a lot gets mixed up. Then SEBI guidelines are supposed to be complied with as well, which maybe a lot of the companies are still not doing. And is there anything to be said on that or no?
Yeah, I think probably, if I'm not wrong, you're referring to the BRSR guidelines of SEBI, business responsibility and sustainability reporting, that will be applicable for top 1,000 market cap companies in India. They would have to project. There is a format which is already there, BRR, business responsibility report, but that is changing for next year. It will be called BRSR. It is a lot more detail required, more comprehensive. And the point which you highlight is very valid. So like it has happened across the world in oil and gas sector very prominently, that a lot of public companies will sell their assets to private companies, and private companies typically will not require that kind of disclosure. So are we trying to hide the problem or brush under the carpet that, okay, as a public company, I'm not polluting, I'm not having asset, which is bad, but ultimately it doesn't help, because there is only one earth which all of us has. And you have private companies which are polluting, and they are much less responsible. So I think that is the approach which many times, which we also deal with, that there is an approach which a lot of asset managers will have, that they will simply not invest in the companies which are bad, which they think are bad. But at the same time, there are some others which say that engagement is a better strategy, because you will ask the companies to reform, to change, and to do things which are right. And which approach is better? So like, I would say that engagement and talking about an issue and then thinking a little more comprehensively is a better approach. You can't have a solution overnight that, okay, fine, on one side, SEBI says that you have to disclose, and because of that, companies under pressure, they will just sell those assets which are not on their books anymore, and they are polluting even more. So I think that that's something which is a problem, which is related to the alignment and not thinking very comprehensively and thoughtfully about the issues, and in the complexity which probably you need to deal with. That's something which will require a lot more effort and a lot more thinking on everybody's part. Of course, I'm not suggesting a solution, but I think that's how it is. That's how it is.
No, it's fair. And, these are complicated matters, and financial system is one part of it. And I think like the way decisions have to be taken so that the day-to-day running of the country is not stopped is quite another. I mean, and I wanted to pose a question to everybody. Maybe we can have a final response, which can also be everyone's final comments. And, there is a lot that has been discussed towards the end of this conversation. We've literally moved towards just the power crisis more. I see there is a question again from Hindu Business Line on the coal exclusion policy, and maybe one of you can answer it online. Otherwise, we can take that question from Ramesh as well. But pretty much it's clear that there are lots of existing challenges that are being faced by the Indian financial system. A couple of some time ago, there was RBI had put a notice which basically said that banks and investors have to consider transition-related risks in their investment, and that's quite important as well. And here we are debating about how it's so complex and complicated, and we have an uphill task. I just wanted to pose one last general question to everyone. What do you think, in your view, are the top 2 or 3 things that the Indian financial sector needs to do in terms of financing for climate action? Could be adaptation, could be mitigation in your view, but what are the institutional measures that banks need to take to be better prepared? I'll just go around the room with everybody who is on the panel, and we'll just follow my screen, and we'll ask you, Abhijit, to go first, and then Smita.
Sure. Thanks. I think a very, very important thing, a very important direction will have to be that eventually all banks of the entire financial system first will have to work in cohesion. That cohesiveness, whether in terms of the understanding of the space, whether in terms of policies, that it will take its time to come. And which is why, and someone asked the question also, who is the more important stakeholder, whether it's the government or whether it's the investor, the banker. So policy always is the great leveler. If we have the right policies in place, if everyone follows it, and that is what sets the direction. Currently, the situation that we are facing is that there's a lot of unevenness in the kind of policies we have, in kind of understandings we have, which leads to all these kind of debates, whether this is good or this is bad. That's the one point. And the second point I want to bring is definitely the long-termism. So this is not something which is immediate. Today, even if India is scaling down on coal, that does not negate the fact that India still has its 2070 target, net zero target. It does not negate the fact that India is still working towards achieving its 2030 renewable energy targets. All that will happen. And over time, eventually technology, the hope is, and the expectation is, eventually technology will also catch up to be able to replace these transition sectors. So in terms of what the banking sector can do, really, like I said, the banking sector, it does not work in a silo. It does not take decisions without taking into factor the decisions and the expectation of everything else, a lot of other factors. All the factors have to play together. I think we as a country are not united in terms of climate action. I don't think there's 2 ways about it. No one will say that no, India doesn't need to do this. So I think we're on the right track. But like I said, it's a very long-term game. We will have to really think about it, come together and work together on this aspect. And the last point is, eventually the hope is that even the data available for making these decisions will also be more easier to come by, and there'll be a lot more data for us to use.
Smita.
Yeah. So we know that Indian banks are still at very nascent stages of its green transition, and only a few of them taking meaningful steps. So what Sagar told, and in fact, Octus ESG has also undertaken a project where we looked at ESG disclosures of a few leading, not only banks, even corporates, and how good or bad it is. And we found a lot of them disclose more on the S aspect in the ESG, very few on the climate related aspects. In fact, so there was, we found some data which was, on India's largest banks. So this was a disclosure to CDP, and it was found that about 6 lakh crores of debt at India's leading banks are at risk from extreme weather events. So greening of the Indian financial system is therefore, imminent. And a key element in this is the ability for the bank to do something like asset tagging, for example. So for sectors or end users, it determines as green or sustainable. And I think Pankaj was talking of opportunities. So this is one way where you can look at the opportunity side of it, allowing the banks easier access to green bond markets, for example, by green tagging. So that's one. Of course, again, that goes hand in hand with development of taxonomies, etc., to kind of enable the whole system. The second point I wanted to talk of was, worldwide central banks are pushing institutions to quantify emissions associated with their portfolios and the impact that this has on credit, on market and liquidity risk. So RBI has also given, initial indications around these things. So measuring financed emissions is also one way to kind of start off on the climate risk dialogue. And so banks like, in fact, there was a data point that I read somewhere that about 700 times it is more, financed emissions is more than, the operational emissions for a bank. So banks like HSBC, Barclays are already starting to put out targets, etc. The next point was, on, developing a risk classification system, so to say. So basically, ranking your exposures. And that would be useful because it's basically the difference between, traditional and climate risk classification lies in, getting into a little more detail, incorporation of locations, for example, context specific aspects, dynamically updating this. So all this will help in, gauging the materiality of climate risks to some degree. And finally, of course, disclosures around the whole climate space, which I spoke about a little earlier. And as both markets as well as regulators, somebody was asking about, is the government responsible or will investors drive it? I think it is both, like it was answered. So while the regulations come at a pace, investor demand will kind of, capital is everything, right? So that is something which will kind of fuel the transition faster, as is also visible in some of the, results which was shown some time back. So to conclude, what I essentially want to say is, like, with the world becoming smaller and India actually being an integral part of, global capital flows, it's only a matter of time before, these global developments can, get kind of translated into the Indian banking system as well.
Thanks. Yes, I think a lot of important points there. There was also a question or a comment on financing emissions, and Sagar answered as well. In your study, you only found one bank, which is Yes Bank, and only one sector, power sector, where they've actually done some work on how you measure financed emissions. So clearly a long way to go. Sagar, yeah, I'll just invite you for your just closing thoughts, given you've presented your study.
Sure. Thanks, Aarti. So basically, just quick few points, like in terms of how we can go ahead with this. Like, first of all, I think there should be an awareness within the banks itself, with the different people who are leading this climate sector within the banks, which we found with multiple meetings with other finance participants as well in the market. And then secondly, as Abhijit highlighted about data gaps, like the financed data, which there are some standards methodology available in the internationally, but I think Indian finance banking system need to get aware with such kind of frameworks available and the kind of data required for assessing or calculating those financed emissions. Thirdly, I think RBI has to take a leading role in terms of taxonomy or providing a climate risk management framework, which should be common or for all the banks, and that can be statutory or guidelines. It depends on RBI how they take a call on that. And lastly, all the financial institutions should align itself with the India's current position for the current goal of 2070. So based on that, I think as Abhijit already said about, like, it's a long-term goal and we have to collaborate and learn from each other and start progressing in this area.
Understood. I'll invite you, Pankaj, as well, to share what you have to in terms of your top reflections of what should be the role of the Indian financial sector on this.
I think on the part, I would say that there is a wide gap between one bank to another. So I would say that if I look at the banks which have been covered in Ashish and Sagar's study also, on the basis of my experience, if all the banks can come together and share their experience and share their knowledge, and if they do a good job in terms of having a formal process of arriving at a response which is based on consensus and which is based on proper research, I think one bank the job it will do, no matter how great it is. But if 20 banks come together and they do that exercise, I think that will be fantastic. So there is a lot more coordination needed. It will be a good thing for the banking system and also for the economy in general, because I would say that it's going to be a very useful thing for the broader economy. Second thing is that in terms of like, forget everything, but if all the banks in India and all the major financial institutions, if they just do proper homework and analysis on just take any framework which you have, like TCFD, CDP, SASB, anything, and just do an honest assessment where you stand. And if top 20, top 25 banks do that exercise, I would say a lot of financial institutions and banks have done a good job. But if everybody starts doing that, I think that will be very, very helpful for their own sake. For themselves, it will be a very useful exercise. And third thing is like, again, we come back to the topic which we had, that are we going to import something which is ready-made from outside? And that space is evolving so fast. So for example, like just because there was a war in Russia and Ukraine, all of a sudden the asset managers' philosophy around defense equipment sector has changed considerably. Like earlier, people were talking about 6 months back. If you talk to anyone, they will say that this in defense and weapons, they are untouchable. I don't want to invest in this industry. But in 6 months, that process and that thinking has changed completely. A lot of people saying that to maintain peace, we need to have some exposure to this industry, and this also requires funding. This also requires investment. So I would say that we need to build something which is more suited to the local requirements and something which is not fickle in terms of your understanding. And that's something which you will develop when the banking system has more coordination and more, I would say, thoughtful response on the issues which they're dealing with. So I would say that I think if we do these 3 or 4 things well, it will be fantastic for not just banking system, but also for the country and for the economy.
Thanks. And there are lots of comments now in the open Q&A as well, which talk about what do you think will be the tipping point to get banks to engage proactively? Where is everything resting? Is it with the RBI? There are other questions on, are you classifying clean energy sectors as a separate sector, or is it still sitting in the overall power sector? And how are banks segregating high carbon intensive sectors from low carbon intensive sectors? And I think there is everything that you and others have said just wrapped around this. I'll bring it to you, Ashish, and maybe allow you to just bring this to a close as well. Lots of insights have been shared, some mostly on what the financial sector need to do, some quite imminent on how the power sector has led to some kind of revelations which we haven't been able to wrap our head around. But there are a few things that will have to be done if India even internationally commits itself, which it has committed, but will give in writing what the net zero plans are for 2070. A lot of states in India are actually figuring out their own net zero modeling pathways. States like even Bihar, some others like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, a whole lot of subnational action, as they call, on just looking at reducing emissions by mid-century and what needs to happen between then and now. Yeah, I think just some insights from you as you close this on what the banking system should really be doing in putting together, plugging the gaps that exist and kind of addressing many challenges that have been discussed in the last 1 hour, and you will have the last word.
Thanks, Aarti, and thanks everybody. This has really been a content-rich and quite heavy but stimulating discussion as well. So really a big round of thanks to everyone, all the panelists and the attendees as well for the questions, really some thought-provoking questions. I think I have a couple of two things that struck me from the discussion. One was around the whole framing of opportunities for banks. So moving away from the negative, if you like, the framing of the discussion around risks and dangers, but looking at opportunities. And everyone knows that India, with its size and its market, has huge financial opportunities in the transition economy in general. Have financial institutions really responded to that to the extent that they can? Obviously not, because there is risk, right? And these are new sectors. There is obviously a risk. It's easier to lend to a coal power plant because this is a model that you've been doing for the last 20, 30 years. whereas lending to different types of transition sectors, whether it's RE projects or decentralized RE or green hydrogen, anything of that sort, is new. So is there a way to collaborate and pool that risk, basically? I mean, we have mechanisms that pool risks already. Why is that not possible among leading banks in India? So you look at some way of spreading the risk out for a new sector where the financing is still, the models are still being developed, spread that risk out. Can we have that kind of an approach that talks about pooling risk to fund transition sectors, whether it's decentralized RE or it's solar agriculture or it's battery storage with tied with solar or wind, etc. So I think that's one whole area to look at going forward. The other is, and sorry, this is, I just want to come back to this without, again, opening that can of worms, but because we've done a lot of work and a lot of people have done a lot of work on the role of coal going forward in the Indian economy, how long, how much, till when, etc. That analysis exists. There are slight variations. It exists in the form of CEA, government bodies. It exists from a number of think tanks, including us. In terms of what does that mean? When can we talk about phasing down, phasing out? And one thing that all of that analysis has in common is that there's no real case for new coal. Yes, the existing coal will need to be online for a while more, a considerable while more, but new coal is not required. So if pretty much everyone is saying that, but yes, there is energy demand is going to continue to grow, and that can be met from RE, and has it's been proven that it can be met from RE. The models exist that show that it can be met from RE and a mix of RE plus storage, managing the grid, etc. So I think having that kind of a mindset that basically looks at, that accepts that we cannot continue to do things as we've done in the past. Yes, but there are risks with changing things, doing things differently. How do we pool that risk? How do we manage that risk? How do we spread that risk so that there's no one sector that is one player that is overly exposed? I think that's quite key. And there's obviously a role for the private sector there, but there's also a significant role for the regulators and the government there in trying to come up with those models that help everyone to pool that risk and make sure that we have the finance necessary to transition our economy over the next few decades. I think that's really important. And yeah, fascinating discussion. There's just a lot of takeaways for me personally from this. Thank you once again to everyone, panelists as well as attendees. It was really great to have you guys on board.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice rest of your day and stay cool. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.